review the draft policy recommendations that have been developed that we'll be sharing with you for your feedback today. And then we want to spend at least 20 minutes or so in discussion with you. And we're going to get to that part as quickly as possible to answer questions, hear what you're thinking, get your feedback, and inform our next steps around further resource development. So we can move on. In terms of logistics for the meeting today, as I just said, we want to spend at least 20 minutes in conversation with you. That'll be at around 10:30. If you have any questions or comments as we go through the material today, please pop them into the chat and we'll do our best to answer them in the moment where we can, but we will certainly circle back to them when we get to our discussion segment. And, we thought it would be helpful as we're going through our hour together today to have some questions that we share with you in advance to be thinking about. As you're hearing what's been going on, as you hear more about the proposed policy updates. So first of these is, what lessons have been learned, given that Iowa has memoranda of understanding in place? What lessons have been learned from that MOU development process that you think we can bring into the work to develop infrastructure funding agreements? So, what have we learned? What can help inform, enhance the work that is to come? If you have anticipation of any specific challenges or concerns that might come up through the IFA development process at the local level, we want to hear about those. So be thinking about that. We want to hear how you think the state WIOA core partners who have been working on this over the last several months can support you as required partners and your local partners in IFA development. We want to hear about areas where there might be additional information needs, whether you have those or your local counterparts might have those. Please be thinking about that. And then we will be talking, as I mentioned, about some of the technical assistance and resources that we have in development, but would love to hear any feedback on additional things that you might find helpful once you've heard what we have in the works for you. So those are just some questions to keep in mind. And with that, let's move to introductions so that we can dig in. Let me pull up the participant list. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to run down the list that I see. And Wendy, I'll start with you. I'm just going to give you an opportunity to say hello.
Perfect. Thanks, Gretchen. Hi, everybody. My name is Wendy Greenman. I'm a Bureau Chief at Iowa Workforce Development in the Workforce Services Division. I oversee the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Title I programs, adult, dislocated worker, and youth. I also dabble in Title III, Wagner-Pizer a little with one of my colleagues, and I also oversee the Trade Act program. So as a core partner, I've been working with some of our other folks on this call on a lot of the MOU guidance and one-stop certification guidance that we'll be talking about a little bit later on in this session. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Wendy. And Darcy, I'll let you say hi as well.
Thanks, Gretchen. Good morning, everyone. I am Darcy Simon in Oklahoma City, and it's been a pleasure to work with the core partner team in developing these recommendations, and we're excited to be able to share their work with you today.
Thanks, Darcy. Darcy's running air traffic control for us today, so I appreciate that. Let me turn next, and let me just say before everybody does introductions, I do know that some of you know each other, maybe all of you know each other, but I think it is helpful for all of us just to say hello. So let me turn next to Bill Brand.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, good. My computer isn't zooming so well this morning, so I'm on my phone. But yeah, my name is Bill Brand. I am the administrator for the Division of Community Action Agencies at the Iowa Department of Human Rights. And my agency administers a variety of state and federally funded programs.
So I went online. So I'm online. It told me I had 1 minute left. My phone refreshed.
Sarah, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay, go ahead, Bill.
Sure. Yeah, so the Division of Community Action Agencies administers the Community Services Block Grant, which is a partner to WIOA.
You still there, Bill?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes,
Yep.
go ahead.
Yep, I was just finishing up saying we're one of the required partners for WIOA through the Community Services Block Grant, which funds local community action agencies throughout Iowa and the nation.
Wonderful. So glad that you're here, Bill. Thank you.
Sure.
Amy Giske, I'm going to turn to you next.
There we go. Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. Good morning, everyone. My name's Amy Giske. I'm the Bureau Chief for Community Colleges at the Department of Ed, and I oversee adult education and literacy for the state. So Alex Harris left. He was been the state director for many, many years and left in October. So I'm acting in an interim capacity with for state director for the program, along with a number of people on my team. So good to meet you all.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amy. Bernadette Beck, I'll turn to you next.
Hi, I'm Bernadette Beck. I am the new policy and special projects person over at the Department of Health and Human Services, and working with Promise Jobs primarily. So I'm just here to listen and learn.
Wonderful. So glad to have you with us, Bernadette. Thank you. All right, Brandy, I'll turn next to you.
Hello, I'm Brandy McCumber. I am the Policy Resource Manager for Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services. I'm part of this core partner working group that was mentioned earlier. And then for my agency, I focus on our policies, internal controls, and all of those documents that many would find probably boring to write. But that is my role there is the maintenance and writing of our reports and federal monitoring.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brandy. Glad you are here. Carolyn Farley.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Carolyn Farley, and I am a workforce program coordinator for Iowa Workforce Development. The programs that I have that I assist with are Wagner-Peiser Foreign Labor, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, and CSEP. So I've been in this role all of about 3 months now. So I'm hoping that I can learn as well as we go through this process. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carolyn. Welcome. And that's, as many of you do, a big portfolio. So really glad to have you with us. Daniel Zinnel, I'll turn to you next.
Sorry, my computer's a little delayed. Good morning, good evening, my gosh. Good morning, Daniel Zinnel, CEO of Proteus. We're a multi-state nonprofit that provides services to agricultural workers and their families. And we implement, one of the programs we implement is the National Farm Worker Jobs Program. And we implement that in Iowa, Nebraska, and Indiana. It's good to see you all.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here, Daniel. That's great. All right, Dennis Harden, I'll turn to you next, Dennis.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Dennis Harden, and I'm the Bureau Chief for Career and Technical Education at the Department of Education, overseeing Perkins.
Excellent. Thanks for being with us, Dennis. All right, I'll turn next to Elizabeth, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce your last name. Please do correct me. Weigand?
That was perfect. So it's Elizabeth Wagan. I'm the Deputy Division Administrator of the American Job Centers under Iowa Workforce Development. I also oversee the RCM and RISIA programs. And then today I am also sitting in for Linda Rouse, who is the Division Administrator for the American Job Centers with Iowa Workforce Development and taking some notes for her.
Excellent. Thanks for being with us, Elizabeth. All right, Carrie Osterhaus, I'll turn to you next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Osterhaus with the Iowa Department for the Blind. I'm the Vocational Rehabilitation Program Administrator, and I oversee our vocational rehabilitation, supported employment, and our business enterprises programs here. And then I'm also part of the core partner working group as well. That was mentioned. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Carrie. All right, let's see. Who's next? Kyle Clabby-Kane.
Good morning, everybody. Kyle Clevy-Kane. I'm also a bureau chief in workforce services at IWD with Wendy. So currently I oversee the Promise Jobs TANF ENT program in Iowa, along with reentry programming, veteran services, the state monitor advocate, and foreign labor. And then once the realignment is passed by the legislature and signed into law by Governor Reynolds, I'll primarily have responsibilities over Title II and Title III within IWD.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kyle. All right, let me turn next to Matt. And is it Uthoff? Uthoff, you correct me, please.
Good morning, it's Uthoff. I am currently the TANF administrator for the Department of Health and Human Services. I oversee the TANF block grant as well as the social services block grant, which is a role I just took on. I was asked just to sit on and listen, but unfortunately I do have to jump off in a few minutes as I have a regional TANF administrator meeting that I have to jump on at 10:30. So I'll just be listening shortly.
Gotcha. Thanks, Matt. And I'll just say for you and any others that might have to jump off early, we will be sending out some follow-up materials for you to take a look at and provide feedback. So this is not your only opportunity. So there'll be a chance for that. All right, let me turn next to Sarah Bath. Sarah Bath, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Good morning. I'm Sarah Bath, and I am an operations manager in the central Iowa area and also a board member for Wagner Pizer.
Fantastic. Welcome, Sarah. And last but not least, I think I've gotten everybody except for you, Teresa Garcia.
Good morning. I'm Teresa Garcia. I'm in the Department of Education. I'm also a member of this core partner working group. In my role at the Department of Education, I'm a consultant for the adult education and literacy program, particularly with program quality. So I'm responsible for the monitoring for fiscal and program compliance.
Fantastic. Welcome. Thank you so much, everyone. This is a great turnout. Did I miss anyone? Has everyone had a chance to say hello? Okay. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time, and really, really thrilled to have you all here. So before I turn things over to Darcy, I just wanted to do a little bit of setup around kind of how we've been approaching, frankly, all of our work together. You know, Wendy mentioned one-stop certification. There have been a lot of things going on in the workforce system broadly in Iowa over the last several years. And so I think it's helpful just to share a little bit about how we orient ourselves to this work. And this is what we've done through the work on the MOU, and it's been our approach with the IFA. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we know you all play a number of different roles in the broader workforce system related to MOUs and IFAs. You know, in some ways, you're going to be interfacing very closely with locals to provide them information that they need as they update MOUs to include IFAs. You are obviously critical program partners, and that's why we're so glad to have you with us today. And I think, you know, as we've been thinking broadly about workforce system efforts in Iowa, we've really been thinking about the role that you all also play as workforce system architects. And the way that we've been coming at this is from the perspective of thinking about designing a system in Iowa that can best serve customers and enable them to be successful and really continuously improve the broader Iowa work system. And so in your role today, you're really coming in the capacity of helping us design guidance for that system that will enable your local counterparts to do that work. So we're really focused on it today, you know, in your role as partners, but also really as architects to help develop state level guidance that can be provided to the local areas and to local partners for their local level implementation. And so as we move through the day today, we'll be asking you to really keep customers at the front of your mind and also keep that broader system orientation at the top of your mind as we think about, you know, what are the important things to share in IFA policy updates that can best enable support for customers, alignment among system partners, and a really robust Iowa work system. So I just wanted to share that with you because those have sort of been the guideposts for us as we've gone through this work with the core partners, and certainly we hope to bring that orientation into the conversation today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Darcy, unless folks have any pressing questions before we move ahead. Please actually pop them in the chat. I know I took a little bit of extra time. If you do have questions, pop them in the chat and I'll monitor that and respond as best I can.
All right. Thank you, Gretchen. And I will also invite you to put in the chat what your level of familiarity is, or even your comfort or confidence level with WIOA Memoranda of Understanding and infrastructure funding agreements. We're going to start today's conversation by just a quick refresh on what is outlined in the federal requirements, and then we'll take that deeper dive into both your current state MOU policy along with those recommended updates from the core partner working group. So as we get started, to swim through the acronym soup, MOUs and IFAs, so some clear working definitions to start our conversation. So the Memorandum of Understanding is the agreement between chief lead elected official, the local workforce board, and each one-stop partner that outlines that operation of the one-stop delivery system. And it also sets that vision and strategy for service delivery by identifying the role that each partner will play. And so it's answering the question of how will the one-stop system provide services, as well as how will it be funded. And when we talk about the infrastructure funding agreement, it's actually a component of the MOA. So thinking of them as a pair, not two separate pieces. And this is detailing that financial plan to fund the services and operating costs of the one-stop delivery system. So that's including the funding of infrastructure costs associated with those comprehensive one-stop centers and affiliated or specialized sites as applicable. And it also includes funding of any additional shared service costs. And to note, when we're talking about the core partner working group that has met and developed these recommendations, because of these fiscal components of the policy recommendations, it's important to note that we did have fiscal representation from our core partners coming and participating in the work today too. So when it comes to who has responsibility for development and implementation of the MOU, including the infrastructure funding and one-stop operating budget, it's designed to be a locally driven process. And so the responsibility of that is the local workforce development board is responsible for negotiating and developing that MOU. And typically they're utilizing their board staff to convene partners and complete the task. But it's important to note that all of the signatories of the MOU have to come to agreement and be able to sign that. So it's really a very collaborative effort across the board and a byproduct of that local system. To expand a little more on how the law describes local board and chief elected official responsibilities with regard specifically to one-stop infrastructure funding, it's very clear that there is a shared responsibility to ensure that one-stop partners adhere to the guidance, and that would be that this state, and then the federal guidance about those cost sharing, working with one-stop partners to achieve consensus and informally mediate any possible conflicts. We'll talk about how the policy recommendation references expectations for negotiations and some of the processes for that. And then also the local board and chief elected official are responsible for providing technical assistance to new one-stop partners and local grant recipients so that they're informed and knowledgeable about what is in the MOU and able to fill those commitments that they're signing to. In terms of who must contribute, it's based on the center and type of center. So for when we're talking about a comprehensive American Job Center, all required one-stop partners in the local area are participating in the sharing of infrastructure costs, regardless of whether or not they're co-located. And then those required partners who have agreed to share in the costs of one or more career services or other shared services are sharing in additional shared costs. When we're looking at an affiliate or a specialized American Job Center, then infrastructure costs are shared by the partners that are engaged in that center. And again, with additional shared cost, it's partners engaged in the center who have agreed to share in those career services or other shared service costs. Last year, as the Iowa State Board defined and issued policy guidance for the certification of your Iowa Works one-stop centers, those definitions of those types of centers were outlined by the state in this manner. So your comprehensive centers have titles 1 and 3 present full-time, with one other core partner present at least part-time. And those comprehensive centers are providing access to all programs, services, and activities of the non-co-located partners. An affiliated center was defined as having 2 or more core partners present with at least one core partner present on full-time basis. And a satellite center as a location where one core or required partner is present on a permanent basis, noting that titles 1 and 3 are not eligible to have standalone offices or be considered satellite centers. So in terms of the guidance, that's the piece that we're here to focus on today. And as we start to talk about our current MOU guidance and the recommended updates, I'll drop a link in the chat about your current policy. I also want to note that following up from this meeting, we will send out a document that has kind of the broad list of recommended changes. For the purpose of time, we're going to pick out the high level biggest changes and biggest recommendations for our discussion. We'll also send out a copy of a draft resource or supporting guide for your feedback, and we'll have an open window for ongoing feedback past today, because I recognize that we're kind of throwing a lot at you, and this is a big task to wrap your head around, as it's not something you do every day. So in terms of the guidance and what's required to be in the guidance, the governors are required by WIOA to issue guidance regarding the infrastructure funding of the one-stop delivery system, and that guidance is issued in consultation with chief elected officials, the state board, and the local boards. So this is the first, and this was an added consultation session that we've added to this list, but know that we'll also be bringing kind of the same roadshow and talking through our guidance updates with these other key groups before on the path to issuing and finalizing everything. And in terms of the requirements for what needs to be in this guidance, and that's, some of the nature of the changes we made, there's guidelines for determining partner program contributions based on their proportionate use and relative benefit received. And then also guidance to assist local boards, chief elected officials, and one-stop partners at a local level in determining those equitable and stable methods of funding the costs, again, based on proportionate use and relative benefit received. So this is where we started, knowing what goal we needed to accomplish to fulfill that our updates and our updated policy complied with these requirements in the law. And before we start actually looking into the details of those recommendations, I want to give the virtual microphone over to Wendy to just share a little bit of context about the work that has gone on in the state of Iowa, bringing us to this point and where we're going from here.
Great, thank you, Darcy. I will do the best I can, but if any of our other core partner representatives would like to pop in, please do so. But I think that's where I'm really going to start talking about before I discuss what's on this page is those core partners. So as I mentioned, and Carrie popped in and mentioned it as well, we have been working as a core partner working group for several years now on a variety of things. And what we're going to talk about today is just one of those many things that we have been tackling. Those core partner representatives include myself from Title I, Michelle McNertney as well, who works with IWD and oversees Title I and Title III as well. Carrie mentioned she's with Title IV, Brandy McCumber with Title IV, and Amy Giske, who mentioned she oversees Title II. So we have been working very hard at all of those things, and we've come a long ways. So we're really excited to dig into this further and bring our required partners in on this conversation, which is really what we're doing today. So again, we really appreciate you being here and collaborating with these efforts. So with that, we did start work on the MOU process development in January of 2021. We released policy on MOU. The core partners worked on that together and based that off of WIOA section 101, of course. The additional guidance, as you can see on the screen, was developed by the group and released in March of 2021. We also had a Q&A session on this information in April of 2021, subsequent to the release of the guidance. That information can all be found on the Iowa State Workforce Board website under LWDB information. And I'm going to follow up with some information after this meeting, so I can be sure to provide a link to that. But it also looks like Darcy put it in the chat. So thank you so much, Darcy. In addition to the MOU process development, we worked on the one-stop certification standards and guidance development. That one took a while, as you could imagine. So we started in 2021. It funneled through to 2022, where we released all of that information and held additional training on that in June of 2022 as well for local stakeholders. So that information can also be found on the Iowa State Board website too. In addition, we had some Department of Labor monitoring, which really pushed us further into knowing that we needed to do additional work surrounding all of this. I would say that since I've been around, some of this is stemmed back to 2017, where we had information in a DOL monitoring regarding MOUs and not having all of the partners at the table back then. With that, we've had additional monitorings where DOL has said that MOUs and IFAs have not been compliant. I think the most recent monitoring that I sat in on was last spring, where it was also a finding for us as well. And they told us they would continue putting it in any and all monitorings they had of our programs up until the point where they see compliance in this area. So we've been working really hard at getting all of these pieces in place so that we can rectify those findings and be compliant in this area. Darcy, thank you, Darcy. So with that, you're seeing on the screen now a roadmap that's hopefully going to help get us to that point. We started meeting September, October of 2022 to develop the process for this guidance. We are working as a core partner team to finalize IFA policy and recommendations and additional supporting resources. Here right now, we're having these consultation sessions. So this is actually our first session with the required partners to make sure that you're on board and your voice is heard in this collaborative process. We will also be meeting with the chief lead elected officials of the 9 local areas to do the same process, and we'll also be working on doing a consultation with the local workforce development areas, as well as the state workforce development board. And all of these things are happening in the coming weeks, and we will have those wrapped up by the end of next month. We are hoping to release policy in June of this year. That policy will be issued by the State Workforce Development Board. In July, subsequent to that policy being released, we are hoping to be able to provide additional technical assistance and supporting resources as these things are worked through locally. And our target implementation date of IFA is July 1 of 2024. So that would be in coordination with the program year 2024 funds being released to local areas. Darcy, Gretchen, any other follow-up that you might think would be helpful with that information?
I can't think of anything, Wendy. I think that was great and really helpful to just kind of ground everyone and get us to the same starting point.
Great, thank you.
All right. So with time in mind, again, as I mentioned, we'll share out a full document that puts your current MOU policy, which I linked and posted in the chat, with the recommended sections or changes. We're going to talk about the high level biggest areas of change or updates around 3 buckets. First is in the category of developing the MOU with the one-stop operating budget and infrastructure funding agreement. We're going to talk about changing the MOU once it's been developed, and we'll talk about expectations for negotiation. And before I get into that, there's one spot I want to specifically flag as a back of your mind feedback area for you all as core and required partners, because the recommendation here is that if any of you have any feedback, what you'll see from your current MOU policy is that list that we're probably all pretty familiar with that comes straight out of WIOA in terms of the expectations of what required partners must do in terms of providing access to programs through the one-stop delivery system, being physically and programmatically accessible to individuals with disabilities. Continuing on to the next slide, that required use of a portion of your funds for infrastructure funding and cost sharing agreements. There's nothing here that we can really remove because it comes from federal guidance, but it was the recommendation of the core partner working group if there was anything to clarify or add in the context of the state of Iowa for how core and required partners work together or expectations of roles and responsibilities. That's one spot in the policy. There's not a change, but I wanted to flag in case you all had feedback. And again, you're welcome to drop questions or thoughts into the chat. We'll also have a window after this meeting for you to kind of process, digest, read through some of our follow-up documentation. And that's another spot where you can circle back with feedback. But starting with those kind of 3 buckets I talked about, the first is in terms of developing the one-stop operating budget and the infrastructure funding agreement, what that looks like for the local process. And what you'll see in these slides is any blue italicized text is added language to your current policy language, which is just there in standard normal black font text. So for this, there wasn't a lot to add, but it did go back to those requirements for what needs to be included in the governor's guidance, which is examples or guidance for examples of cost allocation methodology. And really, it's not for at the state policy level to prescribe which cost allocation methodology a local area chooses. That's developed in that's part of their MOU development process. But what we've done is listed examples and followed the examples of most states in how they address this portion of the requirement, listing examples of cost allocation methodology that we see most frequently used in our work, which are number of customers served, square footage used within that one-stop center, or number of full-time equivalent staff. And again, those are examples of a local area in their negotiations and development of MOU could may be able to find a more innovative way to do that, but that is the change to this part. The other thing that was a change just in terms of the development of the MOU, one-stop operating budget and infrastructure funding agreement, your current policy offered this bulleted list of what is required to be included in the MOU. So period of time effective, the partners, a description of the modification and review process. It was the same information broken out in 2 separate sections, one for infrastructure funding and one for other cost sharing agreements. So the change here is just to combine it and put it into one spot since it's the same information and the same required components that must be in that MOU. So no like life-changing changes to this part, just a couple of things to highlight in how your updated policy will look a little bit different than your previous policy and the rationale for that. On the topic of change, we have a few more bigger level changes. And the first was talking about this concept, and the only term that was defined in your policy, which was substantial change. So your current MOU policy prescribed substantial change as a more than 5 to 10% deviation of any allocation percentages within the infrastructure funding agreement. And it's great that there was some specificity there. I think there's a concern that 5 or 10% to one partner could be really, really different than 5 or 10% to another partner, and the potential impacts and agreement. As well, the U.S. Department of Labor sample MOU and infrastructure cost toolkit offered some other examples of what could be considered a substantial change that aren't only just something we can mathematically quantify. So for example, if you are adding or removing partners, that can have a really big impact for better or worse in terms of how those costs are shared. And that would be something to consider a substantial change where partners need to come back, revisit those numbers, and re-sign off on triggering a renewal of that MOU. Other things are just high-level changes in some of your significant signatories, such as your chief lead elected official, as one of those people that must enter into and be in agreement on this document. If that person is no longer there, then we'll need to re-sign with the person now in their role. So it's important when we think about change to think of what we're talking about as those substantial changes that are the really big ones. And then I don't want to say non-substantial, but the more minor changes that are going to be smaller revisions to the budget or adjustments that come up as part of that annual reconciliation. So what we've done here is removed this definition, and what you'll see in the draft guide is an appendix of a lot of these key terms and definitions that we talk about when we're thinking about everything under the sun with MOUs and IFAs. In terms of reconciliation, again, this is a locally driven process. So from a state level policy perspective, what you are able to require is that reconciliation has to happen. But in terms of how it happens, in what manner, at what frequency, that's something that is determined at the local level in part of the development of the MOU. So the recommended update on the right-hand side of this slide for your current policy is to say that your one-stop operating budget must be periodically reconciled against actual costs incurred and adjusted accordingly. And as part of the MOU development process, local areas will need to develop their own local area process for that periodic review and reconciliation of the one-stop operating budget against actual costs incurred. Best practices we've noted as examples are probably on a monthly or a quarterly basis. And then that budget's going to be adjusted accordingly through an amendment, modification, or renewal based on the nature of that change or that adjustment, things that have come up as a result of that reconciliation or annual review. And so local areas will have the responsibility for ensuring that a current MOU is on file with IWD when those changes are made. Talking more about changes, I'm going to pause to take a quick sip of water, and then we'll talk about the types of changes that we've added or what that change process and the triggers look like for your MOU. Okay, so on the left-hand side of, this graphic is in your guide. It's not part of the policy, but the next slide will show you the policy language that will explain the same thing. I'm going to use this visual to illustrate. On the left-hand side of this chart, you're going to see examples of things that could trigger a type of change to the Memorandum of Understanding. So we just talked about that periodic reconciliation. The cost of something is drastically different than how it was budgeted. We're talking about the annual review of the MOU, realizing that, you know, what we signed a year ago, some things have changed. And your current policy and your core partners also provide for a signatory of the MOU can request a change or can trigger this change process to figure out if a change is necessary or is needed. And so there's some type of change trigger that happens on that left-hand side. And the next step is determining if renegotiation will be required or not required. And that's connected to how substantial or not substantial that change may be. So following along the bottom row of this slide, if it is a substantial change, which could be change in adding or removing partners, maybe relocating to a new center, like things like that, it's going to it will trigger a renewal, which is new signatures are needed and IWD is notified. Now, obviously the responsibility is the same to kind of update or ensure IWD has a copy of a current MOU, but this will just be also a notification that, hey, by the way, we had to renew our MOU because of XYZ. Here's the updated version. On the other hand, if it's not a full renegotiation required, perhaps it's just discrepancies in the budget that need to be reconciled. It's just a modification. So you're updating it, but you're not required to get everyone to re-sign it. And if it is a more substantial change where it's like, oh, we changed vendors, or, you know, whatever it may be, we're getting new signs, something like that, where there's some bigger impacts, that is an amendment to the document where you would be re-signing it. So I'll flip to the next slide. I'm trying to be really mindful of time. I just want to make sure I give you enough information to be able to give feedback. But this language in the policy reflects what I just described through that chart about the 3 types of change and when signatures are required there. And the blue language on the next 2 slides, so for amendment, modification, and for renewal, really has also just been added to reflect and clarify the differences between the 2. The triggers are the same. They're still established through local processes for periodic modification. And again, like same here in terms of change through how an MOU can be changed, those types of changes. I want to get to our last section. So which talks about expectations for negotiating the memorandum of understanding. So again, one of those key things is there has to be consensus and agreement from all partners in developing and signing off on that MOU, inclusive of your infrastructure funding agreement and your one-stop operating budget. And this is one of the areas that I guess fortunately is very clearly outlined and described in federal guidance in terms of having and preserving what's called the local funding mechanism, or the worst case scenario that you want to avoid, which is your state funding mechanism. So we've added some policy language here to just include the processes for triggering that. But ultimately, what's important to know is that if in negotiation of your MOUs, there is an impasse that is persisting. Number one, your state core partner team wants to be brought in, but also even your U.S. Department of Labor Region 5 office wants to be brought in to help working through those impasses and preserving the local funding mechanism to avoid triggering that state funding mechanism where all partners lose a lot of flexibility because it's then at the hands of the governor to determine those cost allocations and contributions. And I'm going to kind of quickly go into the guide to show you or the policy recommendation document to show you a little bit more of that change. It's not something we need to spend a lot of time talking through, but I'll show you what we've added and where it came from. So when you need some really fun reading about infrastructure funding mechanisms, you'll know where to find it. So bear with me for just a second. Okay. So I think you're now seeing our policy recommendation document. Again, it's going to go over a lot of things that we've tried to just highlight in the conversation of sections that we've changed, what your current policy said, and then what the recommended update is. But what you'll see for, try not to make anyone too dizzy with all my scrolling, you had your current MOU policy expectations for negotiation. We've added the piece that I just showed you from that slide. And then in terms of your state funding mechanism, those pieces were pretty clearly described in your Iowa state plan. And again, they followed the pretty clear and specific guidance that's outlined in the law already for these processes. So we've just added them as sections. So one for your state funding mechanism, and then it's the timeline for notification and the required materials that would be submitted to the governor in the event that your state funding mechanism is triggered. The governor's what the governor is doing after being notified and the responsibilities of the governor under that state funding mechanism process, as well as an appeals process. So this language came from your state plan as well as from what is prescribed and described in the law in terms of these processes and things like that. So I don't know that there would be a lot of wiggle room here to change some of these things other than adjusting potentially your timeline, points of contact, those types of things. And the last thing I want you to know about, and I'm actually going to stay in not presentation mode for a second because I'll be showing you one more document as we open the floor for conversation, is this is a lot. This is a really big task of WIOA implementation for our local areas, for you all as partners. It's true system work and collaboration. So I don't think any state has just issued a policy and said, have fun, good luck, go forth. So I wanted to show you, even with your MOU policy, the state developed about a 15-page guide that accompanied an MOU template to guide through like a timeline for completing this process and things to know and do, a Q&A session, recording, and a PDF, and those are available on that state board website that Wendy referenced earlier. And the things that we have queued up to support this update to this guide is we have updated that 15-page guide to include your infrastructure funding agreement and one-stop operating budget guidance. So it's now about 55 pages. That really takes you as partners in your local areas step by step through a cost sharing framework. There's a case study example with each of those steps kind of offered or completed, and an accompanying one-stop operating budget Excel workbook template, so that it really is going to be a great guide for you to go through this process to ensure that you're developing things in a compliant way. And the other piece that will be, I think it was on that timeline that Wendy described to come out probably in July or so, is a recorded training session, more specifically on some of what we've talked about here, and then just this, the framework. So this is what your guide currently looks like, and we've added and really expanded it to have some updates. And then I wanted to just preview the cost sharing framework, that it really does give you a step-by-step going from starting with identifying your centers and identifying your partners, all the way to allocating those costs, determining partner contributions, preparing and agreeing to that infrastructure funding agreement, and then even through those modification processes. So I want you to know that those resources are coming. We will share the draft updated guide with you all for feedback, but that's a great place to start in continuing your thinking and preparing yourself to engage in this process as a local partner, and even helping us to think through and identify training needs and support along the way. So with that left, let me turn it back to Gretchen.
Great job. Can you hear me okay, Darcy?
Mm-hmm.
Great job. I mean, as you all saw, it's a lot of information to cover. And you're our guinea pigs because you're our first consultation session. So thank you for letting us share that with you. And I know we're a little tight on time for questions and feedback, but we absolutely want to spend most of the time that we have left hearing if there's anything sort of immediately coming to mind for you in terms of questions, concerns, or feedback. And then I do want to dedicate just a minute to talk about next steps before we wrap up on time here. So if we can turn to the next slide. I know that we have shared a lot of information with you, and you're probably, if you're anything like me, kind of digesting and processing. We didn't get any questions in the chat, so let me just throw out, anybody have any overarching questions, initial reactions, comments that you want to share? And in the interest of time, you are welcome to just chime in verbally if anything is coming to mind. Anybody are there any concerns or potential challenges that are percolating in your head that you want to be able to share with us today as we think about sharing these resources back with you? Okay, hearing none. Let me just ask as a pulse check, Darcy mentioned, we will be sharing some additional material back out with you. I think, we can certainly share the PowerPoint, and we will be sharing the policy document that talks about the recommended updates as well as the draft guide for your feedback. As a pulse check, are people just feeling like they need a little bit more time to digest before they weigh in on any of these questions?
Are we all just drafting resignation letters right now so that you don't have to do this?
Carolyn, I see your note in the chat, so that looks like a yes. It's a lot to digest. Thank you, that's helpful. And we totally get that. It is a lot to digest. Okay. Well, and that is the good news. Maybe what we do is move on to next steps, because I want to share with you how we're going to be soliciting your input moving forward, because we absolutely want it once you have had a chance to digest. So as I said, we'll be sharing some follow-up materials via email with you, the summary of the recommended policy updates, as well as the draft guide for your feedback. So you can take some time on your own to kind of digest that and think through it. So we'll be sending that out. We are specifically looking for any feedback that you have on the draft guide. We want to make sure that resource is as helpful as possible to you. So once you've had a chance to take a look at that, we would love your feedback. You can send it to this weoagovernance@iwd.iowa.gov address. We're asking for that by April 1st. Certainly, if additional questions, comments come to your mind after today, also please share those forward. We will be actively working over the next couple months to continue work on the guide, and other supporting resources, and to finalize the policy for the state board review and approval, which will actually be in June 2023, not May. So this is a big job of work, and we really, really want your input on it. On the right-hand side is just a note about upcoming consultation sessions over the next several weeks that we will be doing. And then looking ahead, one thing to think about as you digest all of this is how you all as partners might be able to support local areas as they move into implementing one-stop operating budgets and infrastructure funding agreements. So think about ways that you can provide information and data that your local partners will need to complete these pieces, and that will be on a per center or per local area basis. Making sure that you have staff in place that can help support those locals, and that your local counterparts and partners are aware of what the requirements are. And as you think about the kind of data and information that locals are going to need to do this work, costs to consider include things like internet costs and membership dues, like to chambers of commerce, outreach materials for the center, and fees for shared customer assessment tools. So these are just some things to be thinking about. Again, you can kind of percolate on these moving forward. Okay, I know we are right at time. So yes, we just want to say thank you. I know we've shared a lot with you here. We really appreciate the time, and we really, really do want to hear from you, and we want your feedback as we move forward in this process. This is really important that you are engaged in it and have the opportunity to participate and provide that feedback. So thank you for being with us. And I think the next slide is contact info for Wendy, who is point on this activity. So just want to make sure you have Wendy's contact info, as well as the WIOA governance email, which we'll include in our follow-up materials that we send out to you. So thank you all very much for the time today. We really, really appreciate it. And we will be talking with you, we're sure, over the next couple months. So thanks.
Thank you all.